Good morning. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Susan Zhu, and I'm an assistant professor in the management department. I'm really excited and grateful for the opportunity to be here today and share some of my research with you. So when we talk about factors that contribute to the research practice gap that we're probably all familiar with, we often talk about this idea of research getting lost in translation, where the findings are not communicated or presented in a way that managers or practitioners are able to consume or to be able to apply to their workplaces. But research can get lost way before it gets to the translation stage. When researchers sometimes fail to identify or ask questions that are relevant and timely to managers and practitioners, employees in those organizations. So today I'm going to talk about two studies where we try to avoid getting lost before translation, where we incorporate practitioner and manager perspectives to try to understand their perspectives and then try to avoid getting lost before translation. So the first project that I'm going to talk about is a research grant that's been funded by the Department of Defense. And then first I want to acknowledge the research team here, that they make everything possible, so this really is a team effort. And then before I talk more about the specifics of the study, I wanted to provide some context in terms of why the military was interested in funding our research. So despite prevention efforts, suicide and sexual assault rates have been increasing in the military among service members. And when it comes to suicide, in fact, since 9/11, there's been more than 30,000 service members who have died by suicide versus the 7,000 who have died in combat or training alone, combined. So that's a staggering difference there. And as you can imagine, both suicide and sexual assault are associated with a number of negative military outcomes. So each year, the military actually spends close to $800 million to cover the cost associated with sexual assault. And that's in stark contrast with the $24 million that's budgeted to prevent sexual assault each year. So the math isn't quite adding up there. And then in the past, what the military has done in terms of prevention efforts is that they've tended to be more siloed. They've really focused on those harmful acts after they've happened or in those later stages. So then our research team took a more integrative approach. We wanted to identify risk factors that may happen early on and then see if we can reduce those initial risk factors and in order to prevent some of these more severe consequences from happening later on. So this is where our research comes in. We draw on the work and work psychology and social psychology literature to propose that social ostracism, or the phenomenon of being excluded or ignored by others in social or work settings, can be a common risk factor for various forms of violent, abusive, and harmful acts, both self-directed as well as other-directed in military settings. So then the overarching research question, really the research goal of the grant, is that we wanted to understand, can reducing ostracism early on within military settings, so really when people are just coming together, those social hierarchies are getting formed, can we reduce instances of ostracism there, and would that prevent future harmful acts from manifesting? So we're currently in the first year of the research grant, so I'm just going to provide a quick overview of the 3-year research roadmap in terms of the major milestones that we have. And to echo what I said in the beginning of the presentation, we wanted to make sure that we were not getting lost before translation here. So we really wanted to be boots on the ground to understand those firsthand experiences from the military members. So the first two major military, or first two major research milestones that we've looked at is we are going to interview military leaders as well as junior military members. To understand their perspectives and to also understand what they think would be effective in terms of reducing ostracism. And then those insights will inform the intervention that we're currently developing that looks to reduce ostracism at the individual level, the team level, and the leader level. So the next summer, we're going to conduct a pilot study to test the initial effectiveness of this intervention. So we're going to partner with Fort Knox, which is in Kentucky, about an hour and a half away, and which cycles through over 6,000 cadets each summer. So we're going to be partnering with their summer cadet training in order to test the effectiveness. And then at the end, we're going to present our findings to military stakeholders. So the other parts of the grant are ongoing, but we did go up to the Army War College in Pennsylvania this summer, and we interviewed a group of high-ranking military leaders. So we wanted to understand what did they see in terms of ostracism within their ranks. And so these are highly experienced folks within various specialty across different branches, because in different specialty and branches, the norms and the cultures are very different. So it was really helpful for us to understand those different nuances. So the military leaders had a lot to say on this topic. So I'm going to give you the highlights here. So they said that ostracism is a pervasive issue in the military that leads to severe negative consequences. However, very little attention has been paid to it, and when leaders see it, they almost have no resources or guidance on what they should be doing. And this is not surprising because we heard a lot of stories from the military leaders that the military actually uses ostracism as a tool to get people who've fallen out of line, to get them back into the fold, and to get them to perform better. So it's actually almost normalized in some instances. But it doesn't always work. We certainly heard a lot of stories where intentional and unintentional ostracism unfortunately resulted in instances of suicide, drug abuse, murder, domestic abuse, and then of course those things also have impact on work outcomes as well. And then when you think about the military, it's unique in a way that it blends together work and life. So if you're being ostracized or someone is being ostracized at work in the military, they go back to the barracks and they're living with the same people. So sometimes there's no escape and no social support there. And then finally, we asked the military leaders in terms of what would be effective or ineffective intervention or training that would help reduce ostracism. All of them, the first thing they said was, do not put people through a PowerPoint presentation. Like death by PowerPoint is what they called it. So with that said, let me continue with my PowerPoint presentation and put you through it. So I'm going to pivot here a little bit and talk about blind hiring practices within the HR context. This is where I conduct most of my research. And so first of all, what is blinding? I think people have seen The Voice, but the process of blinding can be seen in orchestra auditions or The Voice, which is a singing contest, where the judges are essentially blind to the surface characteristics of the performer. They're really only focused on the performance itself. So then in organizations, blind hiring essentially removes irrelevant information from applications such as name, gender, graduation year, or university, because all of those things can signal things like race, religion, socioeconomic status, all of those things that contribute to unconscious bias and discrimination during the hiring process. And then I actually presented some of this results to my HR master's students, and I had a number of students who came up to me after class and said that this has happened to me before. Like, I've kind of experienced this type of bias. And one student actually legally changed her name to not have to deal with this issue in the hiring process. So this is a relatively new hiring policy, but recent research has shown that it is effective in fostering diversity in organizations. Minority candidates who go through blind hiring process are more likely to advance to later hiring stages and then eventually receive those job offers. So again, we wanted to make sure that we were not getting lost before translation here. To echo what I said in the beginning. So my co-authors and I, we conducted a large study looking at hiring managers, just trying to get an understanding in terms of, okay, what are they thinking? How do they perceive blind hiring policy? And what we found was that blind hiring is not widely known. And for the people, or for the organizations that do know it, it's not widely implemented. And for the HR managers, they told us that they're reluctant to even look into this or implement it because they're uncertain of how stakeholders will perceive the policy. So this was really helpful, right? Even though this was for a practitioner journal, it was helpful for us to be able to identify that issue that's facing hiring managers. So to look at that research question, my co-author, Sean Fath, who's at Cornell, he and I set out to study, well, how would various organizational stakeholders evaluate firms using blind hiring? So we conducted 3 studies where we looked at job seekers, investors, as well as HR professionals. And for the research, we leveraged signaling theory to argue that stakeholders will infer characteristics of the firm via its hiring policy to form various types of evaluations and perceptions. Across the 3 studies, we asked stakeholders to tell us their evaluation of the firms on procedural fairness, firm performance, and diversity commitment. So for these three studies, they were 3 experiments, where in each experiment we sampled a different stakeholder group, and then we created different materials that were relevant to them to be able to show the manipulations. So I'm just going to walk you through that really quickly. For study 1, we sampled active job seekers, and we had them review a mock LinkedIn job ad that either described the blind hiring policy, the affirmative action hiring policy, or the control. And then after reading it, they responded to the 3 evaluations that I showed you on the previous slide. And then for study 2, we sampled active investors, and we had them read a snippet from a human capital practices section on a 10-K statement. And this is realistic because in 2020, the SEC came out with a mandate that public firms must disclose their HR practices. So this is information that investors already have access to. And then finally, for study 3, we sampled current HR professionals, and we showed them various LinkedIn company profiles, and we asked them to provide their evaluation toward that company. So all 3 stakeholder groups generally viewed firms that use blind hiring to be more procedurally fair, more likely to outperform competitors, as well as more likely or more committed to diversity compared to affirmative action hiring or control. And then for each of the study, we also asked behavioral intention questions that were relevant to the stakeholder group, and we found that investors were more likely to invest in firms that adopted blind hiring, and HR professionals were more likely to recommend blind hiring to their own organizations. So overall, we found that blind hiring policy is evaluated positively by job seekers, investors, and HR professionals. So this could be initial evidence to support the implementation of blind hiring in companies. So across these two studies, we attempted to avoid getting lost before translation by really making an effort to integrate manager and practitioner and stakeholder perspectives. And it was really helpful because it allowed us to better understand the context as well as identify research questions that we may have missed. So by reducing loss before translation or by avoiding it, we hope to reduce the research practice gap. With that, thank you so much.